You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. If you have adolescent kids or perhaps spend a lot of time on TikTok yourself, you've probably heard the phrase, trust the process. It's a reminder to stick to the long-term plan, even when the current results might look a little bit messy. But what if we applied this same approach to comparative law? My guest today is Randall Stephenson. Randall argues that comparative law is stuck in a muddle. He suggests that we need a radical rethink, that we need to trust the process and see the law not as a series of dusty old books and statutes, but as a river, constantly ebbing, flowing and changing. Today, we're going to be discussing the mad dance of atoms that happen when we use a pencil and how there is no such thing as sameness in nature. Randall, I'm very much looking forward to you opening up my third eye.
Happy to do so.
Welcome to the Lawcast. Great that you're here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, let's get straight to it. I want to go back to the pencil.
Yes.
As I read your article that you gave me in preparation for today's podcast, and it was quite cool because you suggest that at the atomic level, if we zoom in, that a pencil is a mad dance of electrons that will never repeat itself. Mm-hmm. If a wooden pencil is so dynamic when we're sketching doodles during a law lecture perhaps, why do we treat the legal system as a static object?
It's a great opening question and a lot of things to unpack there, in particular three, I would say. First, your question, of course, alludes to process-relational philosophy or process philosophy, a unique creature of the 20th century, which, although it has its ancient roots in fragments from Heraclitus the Obscure, who famously said, you can't step into the same river twice. His student Cratylus said, aha, you can't step into the same river once. This view of the world, and reality in particular, focuses on the processual and interrelational aspects of the world, and this results in a profound epistemic or epistemological shift. And it's, I think, wise to start right up front by focusing on what the shift looks like. There is no identity nor sameness in nature, and there is no staticity. So a fixed state where there is no change or dynamism. Okay. And all is relational and process coordinated, including our perceptions, facts, and knowledge itself. The second point, in answer to your question, you refer to a massive legal system. Well, of course, this involves exploring our early legal education as legally trained professionals. And I think we have to go back to our first year. I don't know whether you had anything like I did in terms of an introduction to legal reasoning or legal methods.
Yes, I remember we had something, what was it called? Legal theory and laying down the law.
Laying down the law. So I remember being disabused. So I had ironically gone to law school 3 short years after being introduced to process philosophy. So this process of thinking like a lawyer was almost engineering the processual way of thinking out of me. So I remember having particular difficulty with the law school admission test and its logical reasoning component, which was based upon the is of identity and the idea of two-valued logic. All propositions are either true or their negative is true. And this was, of course, the way we think about as lawyers in handling complex socio-political problems. And this also importantly, and this will be something that we talk about hopefully today, is this idea of process philosophy being a paradigm shift from the substance-ontic model. The substance ontology throws us in a world full of objects, substances, and things, rather than processes. So in terms of fleshing out this substance-ontic model, I think there's probably 3 features of it worth setting out from the beginning, which is that the most appropriate paradigm for ontological discussion about what's really real is a physical thing that exhibits timeless qualities. The second thing is even persons are ontologically derivative of things. So we best understand human behavior as things. And thirdly, that the processes of change and dynamics and time itself are downgraded in intellectual discussions or omitted altogether. And then lastly, I think your question unavoidably implicates domestic law, where my first urge to challenge these substance-ontic presumptions was actually in my comparative law studies, which is interesting because I started by learning, disabusing myself of processual thinking in order to think like a lawyer. And it was only by studying comparative law that those proclivities reignited, as it were. And I was given an opportunity to generate a course on comparative law at the University of Freiburg. And three things in the process of building that course resonated with me. The first was James Gordley's contention, who's an American comparativist, who said that you need to adopt a comparative perspective to even understand your own domestic laws correctly, which at the time struck me as not only plausible, but sensible. I thought that seems like there's something to that. The second was Professor Ralph Michels' comments in the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Law, where he said, despite there being over 8 separate variants of functionalism, which is comparative law's dominant method, most comparativists don't even state what their method is, let alone how they go about comparing, which is interesting. And lastly, the postmodern critiques of functionalism by Gunther Frankenberg and Pierre Legrand really stuck with me, both for their boldness and making claims that just didn't sit well with my prior processual training. So all by way of saying it's these separate things together where when I considered these things together, it resonated with this idea of process philosophy again as being the way forward to scratch that intellectual itch that came up, as it were.
Okay, so the world is ever changing. It's not this black and white that the law often lays down. Rather, we have something you said there, and that really struck with me to better understand it when you're comparing. I remember when I learned German, and I was like, why do you guys have these clauses and this, that, and the other? I don't understand it. Why don't you just do it like in English?
Yep.
And then they're like, oh, no, you got that in English as well. And then I was like, oh, really? Oh, and then that kind of was struck for me as well. I was like, I see. Okay. So it was only by a kind of understanding my own language better that I was able to compare and understand another language as well.
That's a great example. And where I come from in Canada, I had a lot of exposure to American law. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court prides itself on not doing comparative law. They have this really fierce exceptionalism where they treat what's going on outside of their jurisdiction as though it's of no immediate relevance to developing their own legal system, which is interesting as a counterpoint.
That's right, exactly. Well, that actually brings me to my next question then, which would be about comparative law. And the Americans don't apparently seem to like doing it, but it's popular elsewhere. It's certainly popular here in Germany and Europe, comparative law. Can you take a moment then to explain to me and the audience what comparative law actually is and why we do it? Why do you like comparing legal systems?
Sure. I think that starts with addressing the unspecified verb of comparison, which of course is how specifically do we do it?
Correct.
And before the 19th century, in preparation for this podcast, I just went through and sort of revisited a lot of the original legal history on comparative law, just to refresh my own knowledge and understanding of the matter. But it appears that there was not a lot of objective and systematic analyses of foreign law systems before the 19th century. And to the degree to which you can discern some criterion for what effective comparison means, it's that idea of objective and systematic analysis. And this, we'd be remiss if I didn't mention the 1900 Paris Congress. So the birth of modern comparative law effectively occurred at the first International Congress of Comparative Law in the summer of 1900 in Paris. And while German scholars in the early to mid-19th century were producing notable scholarship, a significant academic rupture occurred as a result of the Paris Congress. And what we saw is that comparativists like Ernst Rabel, who's commonly seen as the father of functionalism, we'll get there.
We'll be returning to Ernst, that's right.
He began posing questions not simply in descriptive or classificatory terms or classic substance-ontic terms, but in functional terms. And I would say that in that way, the sort of waves of optimism and progressivism that permeated that Congress can be seen as giving rise to, in some ways, the dawn of modern comparative thought.
Can you just give an example of what that means by this, looking at it in substance terms?
Yeah, well, so one of the reasons we do comparison and one of the ways we can do it is a taxonomic way. So if you're familiar with the private law theorist Peter Birx, for example, a master in taxonomy, this idea of classifying differences in legal rules and making sure that they have their own place and they don't admix with other areas. This approach is very much based upon traditional ideas of defining legal rules carefully and putting them in watertight compartments and classifying them in a way that helps us understand the sort of broad panoply of all the different forms of regulation that we have in a legal system.
A bit like those kids' toys where you put the squares in that square box, the triangles in that one, and that's right, they don't mix kind of thing.
Not fundamentally unlike that at all. And in terms of what comparative law is, quote unquote, I think you have to also deal with two other points in answer to your broader question, which is over its relatively short 125-year history, there's been significant disagreement about what comparative law is, and from an ontological level in terms of its reality. And there's been three particular theories advanced. The first is that it's simply a method, that it's merely a technique of study and research with no real foundational rules or substance of its own. The other is that it's been approached as a science, not unlike a deductive nomological science like biochemistry, for example. 19th century German jurists were not uncommonly dealing with that approach. And the other one that I find the most interesting is, does it exist at all? So Cambridge professor Harold Gutteridge often emphasized the label's emptiness and that there doesn't appear to be any disciplinary content to comparative law or select body of rules when we compare them to domestic legal systems. Nevertheless, despite these ontological concerns, there's 5 common reasons why we do comparative law, and they're very conventional and well understood. The first, as you mentioned, is improved understanding. It's a way that we can get a better understanding of the contingency of our own legal system and that there isn't one truth when it comes to solving common socio-political and economic problems. The other is conflict of laws. So in private international laws, especially we see in commercial disputes, it's not clear whose jurisdictional rules apply in particular disputes. The other reason we do it is for unification. One of the earliest impetuses for functionalism and unification efforts was in trying to standardize commercial rules in order to facilitate international trade. And that's also another reason to do it is transnational business, is to facilitate as the world gets more and more close through globalization and increased trade routes. That's been a push towards simplifying. And the other reason is to provide legislative and judicial assistance. So we find, for example, the need to address gaps in the law and to have well-researched law reform recommendations. So a good example was we had a talk presentation recently by former Chief Justice Aaron Brock of the Israeli Supreme Court. And he was humble enough to admit that in Israel, because of the relatively junior approach to constitutional design and that their constitution is arguably only 75 years old, that they had to be thrust into the idea of embracing comparative law. They had no choice but to do it in order to maximize the efficacy of their own domestic legal system. So those would be the main points.
Yeah, absolutely. That certainly then makes sense why we do it. I don't know, do you work at all closely with the Institute in Hamburg?
Not closely. I think in some ways my interest in comparative law saw a little bit of disciplinary drift on my part, where I just had an intellectual itch due to my doctoral work was also comparative, and my main project at the Freiburg Institute is comparative.
Yes,
I started thinking, do we actually know what we're doing? Because I'm not quite sure that everyone does. And then just in order to satisfy that curiosity, it brought me into taking these issues seriously.
No, because I know we've had one of the researchers from Hamburg on the show, and they were also it was also about comparative law and looking at different legal systems to work out how to plug the gaps, but how to, especially if you had parties from, as you say, multiple jurisdictions in Germany, and then how does one deal with that? But okay, now we know more about why we compare the law, what comparative law is or isn't. But you are kind of suggesting that comparative law is stuck in a bit of a muddle at the moment.
For lack of a better term.
For lack of a better term, that's right. Caught between, and you quoted, or you wrote in your paper, rigid functionalism and endless description. Now, you brought up the name Ernst Rabel before, and he has a theory of rough functionalism. Could you suggest why you believe that if we go back to this theory, or over 100-year-old theory, how this could kind of break us out of this muddle that we're currently in.
Sure. And in order to do so, I have to start with what the primary outcome of my studies on the postmodern critics, who have been of immense importance in making this debate relevant and sort of asking difficult questions that get us thinking about the limitations of conventional approaches to functionalism. But one of the curiosities that I found is that Günter Frankenberg and Pierre Legrand's work seem to be dichotomizing comparative methods into either their characterization of functionalism, which I argue is quite positivistic and substance-ontic in its flavor, versus their alternatives, which in Pierre Legrand's case is what he refers to as an odd hoc system of negative comparative law protocols. In some of his articles that they number in the hundreds. And they're not wholly systemized, and I don't think it would be fair to expect them to be. But that struck me as both artificial, because process philosophy challenges all two-valued thinking and splitting, and also unhelpful, because a lot of the claims that were being made, they were inconsistent with my own readings of what limited theoretical title deeds we had to functionalism, which, by the way, as any comparators will know, we have very little. We have about 40-plus pages in Zweigert and Kutz's classic Introduction to Comparative Law, and maybe even less on the Chapter 3 on method of functionalism. And my readings of those sources, this is even irrespective of Ernst Rauwel, this is before you go back to the beginning, seem to be strained.
Didn't sit quite right with you.
I remained unconvinced, as one of my former lawyer mentors used to say. And above all else, and I want to avoid reading anything from my paper, but there's a passage, a famous passage from Ernst Rauwel in 1924, which when I presented this to our department, I call the smoking gun. This to me was what got me thinking that there was a different interpretation of functionalism worth pursuing. And if you don't mind, I'll read this because it's worth reading.
Certainly, yeah.
So the passage reads, "The student of the problems of law must encompass the law of the whole world, past and present, and everything that affects the law, such as geography, climate, and race, developments and events shaping the course of a country's history, war, revolution, colonization, subjugation, religion and ethics, the ambition and creativity of individuals, the needs of production and consumption, the interests of groups, parties, and classes. Ideas of every kind have their effect, for it is not just feudalism, liberalism, and socialism which produce different types of law. Legal institutions, once adopted, may have logical consequences, and not least important is the striving for a political or legal ideal." This is the key. "Everything in the social, economic, and legal fields interacts. The law of every developed people is in constant motion, and the whole kaleidoscopic picture is one which no one has ever clearly seen." And that, to me, was a game changer.
My golly gosh, yeah.
As I argue in my paper, the similarities to process philosophy and its key principles of flux, abstraction, and multidimensionality are striking. And this is a passage, for instance, that you can find in Zweigert and Kutz's text, basic text. But they suggest that the takeaway from that is that comparatists must make every effort to learn and remember as much as they can about foreign civilizations. And to me, that was like breaking into Fort Knox and taking a nickel. There's more to this, and less, you could say. But I concluded that the functionalist method cannot be faithfully, let alone charitably interpreted without processual thought. And in that way, I thought Rauwel can be construed as revealing functionalism's native structural metaphysics, or its underlying philosophy. And that, to me, as I say, I called the smoking gun. But every time I read it, I get goosebumps, and I'm further convinced that this. And by the way, that's the time. That was his zeitgeist at the time. So the heyday of processual thinking was the early 20th century. So that would have been the world into which he was brought up and educated, which is innovations in theoretical physics and quantum mechanics and relativity theory, and this idea that we're not thrown into a world of objects, but of processes and change.
But when you read that there, really got me thinking, it's the smoking gun, as you say. But if you read that and if you really take that into account, if you are a student of comparative law, well, are you not just going to give up and say, well, how do I possibly compare all that? It's too unique to compare. how does Ernst Rubbel, or how do you yourself then say we should use this functionally to actually compare? Because it seems it's like, well, the kaleidoscope is too big. Where would I even start?
Mm-hmm. So what I argue in my latest paper on this one is that by synthesizing Rubbel's early functionalist theory with process-relational principles, first what it does is exposes the postmodern critique of functionalism as arguably imprecise and overstated, in that it arguably misconceives the central elements of difference and similarity, and by failing to distinguish the order and relationships between the levels of abstraction, which we can go into, these have drastic implications for the possibilities of comparative law. Mm-hmm. So it starts off by challenging the idea that functionalism, and this is, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Pierre Legrand because it's so memorable, is that he calls it a vast equivalency producing machine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In that the functionalist method basically imposes the best, one truth, one solution on other jurisdictions at the expense of a deeper appreciation of difference and cultural difference in particular.
Yes. Okay.
And I think that that's something that process philosophy challenges, because I argue that difference and similarity must be reinterpreted in processual terms. And when we do that, it changes the outlook and possibilities of comparative law altogether.
It got me thinking there. I mean, the phrase comparing apples and pears. The first one there is comparing apples and apples. We're saying everything that does, this law is an apple, that's a pear, that's a banana.
Yep.
And then we've got the one who compares the apples with the pears and says, you can't really do it like that. And then we got the one who says, no, that's not even a fruit. Mm-hmm. Is that roughly right? They would say, this is an apple. And he's like, no, that's not even a fruit. This is something completely different. This kind of law.
Yes. And by the way, I think it's worth, at this point, giving you a little more detail in terms of how processual thinking changes the name of the game. Mm-hmm. And we can start with what, and this I'm quoting from Alfred Korzybski's work. He was a very early process thinker who wrote a very famous book, well, an infamous book, I would say, in 1933 called Science and Sanity, which was a very big synthetic work where he tried to understand how human beings evaluate and where the vulnerabilities are for producing error, and what that means both individually and for society and the scientific method as a whole. And he has this idea of what he calls the natural order of abstraction. And this is important because we never start with reality. We start with abstraction, which is that we're built physiologically in a way where our ability to take information from the world outside of our skin is very limited. Mm-hmm. We're actually quite bad at it. This actually supplies the basis for all our subsequent descriptions, inferences, beliefs, scientific theories, etc.
And why are we bad at it?
It's because, well, here's the example. The best example I got is there's a transduction of energy where what's happening around us is happening at 186,000 miles per second in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. The fastest transmission speeds of our nervous system have been clocked at 225 miles per hour.
Oh, okay.
So there's a massive difference between what's going on
in the world
at a subatomic, and how it interfaces with us at the most basic perceptual level. And this idea is that this natural order of abstraction is that we start with experience first, then words.
As in what we know, and then with describing it.
Exactly. Okay. So contrary to the postmodern critique, this is the thing that got me at first, is that all human evaluation, including comparison, and there'll be more interesting to be said about that, is actually based on difference. So it's unavoidable. So Legrand in particular states that the differend is everything. Yeah. Differentiation is our pathway to knowledge. Mm-hmm. And on a certain level, that's absolutely correct. But in terms of process philosophy, we have no choice, if we subscribe to the natural order of abstraction, to begin with difference. Mm-hmm. We're immersed in a world of difference. So, in fact, one of the best descriptions of I've seen is that all sensory experience is news of difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
So, at a very basic, if his claims are true, is that functionalism, the comparative method, is a vast equivalency producing machine. What about that?
That's right. But
how is it being misused
with,
to avoid that result? Mm-hmm. And it gets even more interesting when we look at the comparatively neglected concept of similarity. Mm-hmm. So according to Alfred North Whitehead and Korzybski, a similarity is best understood as a difference that makes no difference.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing metaphysical or strange about it.
Yeah.
It's a process of human abstraction, is that we alone, as far as we know, can abstract in limitless orders of abstraction. So from our descriptions about what we perceive of what's going on to our inferences about our descriptions all the way up to science 2026.
Yes.
And this ability to abstract is the engine of similarity and comparison. So this is what's really interesting to me, is that similarities then are best understood as being read into nature by human beings. So what is quintessentially human about the exercise of our comparative and evaluative efforts is not at the level of difference. To quote William James, who's, I found it a process psychologist who I always loved, he referred to conscious mental life, and he's writing in the 1880s, late 1880s, as a great blooming and buzzing confusion, which we share with all living organisms. Yeah, exactly. All living organisms on Earth. What is uniquely human is when we start recognizing or discerning similarities, differences that don't make a difference. And that exercise of human intelligence and evaluation is uniquely our own. So one of the interesting forensic turns, I think, was that it's not that all thinking is about the different. All thinking is actually about similarity. And that similarity is premised upon difference. And this is where, again, I found there's a looseness in the epistemological modeling here in the postmodern critiques that don't quite add up. So for me, going forward, the idea was that for human evaluation to occur at all, we comparativists must engage in higher order abstracting. The real point of concern is determining when and how best to do so, and to what effects, not whether to do so at all. So a functionalist, like any other legal comparativist, has little or no say in the matter. So taking on board these inconsistencies, these tensions between a process model, I found that there's no obvious answer to them in the postmodern literature. And for me, that was the way forward.
Okay. And that's a perfect time to have a little break now. And then when we come back, we are going to talk about why becoming a similarity engineer could be possibly the most important skill in modern comparative law.
Sounds good.
All right, so stay tuned.
Allow us to introduce you to the wealth of information found on the Max Planck Law website. Discover a range of events, from researcher-led presentations and reading groups to workshops and conferences, many of which are open to the public. Keep up to date with our news, explore the tangible impacts of our research, and peruse Perspectives, our online publication offering insightful articles on current legal issues. And of course, for those looking to pursue a PhD or postdoctoral research, you will find everything you need to know about our many academic opportunities. Visit our website today, law.mpg.de.
Well, welcome back to the Lawcast. I'm joined today by Randall Stephenson, and we are discussing all things comparative law, process-relational philosophy, Ernst Rubbel, and the amazing atoms in a pencil.
Good night.
Randall, welcome back. So, a little bit just before the break, I brought up the term similarity engineers. Now, this is something you write about in your paper. So tell us, what exactly is a similarity engineer? I've kind of got an inkling what that could be, but I'd like you to flesh that out for us and tell us why this is such an important skill for comparative lawyers to possess.
It's a great question, and to give credit where it's due, the idea was inspired by Pierre Legrand's own interesting but problematic idea, I would say, by suggesting that all legal comparatists become solely difference engineers. So for him, there can be no thinking without the different. So difference is so much a focal point of doing appropriate comparative law in his view. And he would probably have problems with the idea of even method in comparative law. He embraced what he referred to as tracing. So the idea is that we comparativists almost think about it like we're on an archaeological dig site. Let's interject some dinosaur analogies into here. Why not? Who doesn't like them? You can imagine being on a dig site in the Badlands in Alberta, for example, right? And you've all got your fine little brushes and whatever, and you're very gently and carefully cataloging genealogical and archaeological differences, careful step by careful step. This is the idea behind his approach to it, which is a focus on this never-ending process of discovering differences, particularly cultural differences.
But in this case, different bones, different, that's what you're suggesting, right? That's what we're looking for. We've got a big dinosaur and we're trying to calculate where does everything go here, how does it fit? This bone's different to that bone.
Exactly.
But they're somehow connected.
Yes, and in the course of doing so, we're performing a valuable role as difference engineers. And by the way, Gunther Frankenberg also, I think, stated it very pragmatically, where he said that functionalist scholars are simply not likely to either recognize or respect, let alone relish differences. That's why we have to become difference engineers.
Difference engineers or similarity engineers?
Difference engineers.
He suggests that's why we need to become difference engineers.
That's right,
yes.
that's right. The similarity engineer was a play on those words.
Nice.
Inspired by the implications of processual thought, which is that, as I mentioned before, the distinctly human skill necessary for comparativists and human evaluation is not difference, but rather similarity, which only results from our unique ability to gauge in higher order of abstracting. So what I thought was, yes, it's important to be a difference engineer, but if all similarities are based upon difference and all human evaluation is based on difference, it's equally important, if not more important, to become a similarity engineer and to understand the complex epistemic relationships between the two phenomena. So I would say, and this again goes back to William James's idea that without abstracting in higher orders, we, along with all the animal kingdom, are trapped in this lower order realm of conscious mental life of one great blooming, buzzing confusion. So this idea of becoming similarity engineers is to understand how this reorientation of functionalism from this vast equivalency producing machine to something that requires, in a way that I think Pierre Legrand and Frankenberg would endorse, is this vast directed communication of difference as an important, one would say crucial initial step into sort of getting all the raw materials on board that you need to produce insightful, sensible similarities between competing legal systems, between different legal systems.
But that would then seem to suggest, well, at least in my mind, taking a step back in some ways from when you're trying to compare two laws to say, we need to move back, stop looking at the difference first, let's look at the similarities. Is that how one then goes about it? Or one can find similarities and differences?
Yeah, I think that the idea is that probably has to be understood mostly in line with functionalism's own methodological steps. And there's 5 of them, which I argue are similar in structure to Korzybski's natural order of abstraction. So this is what's a very important element that's commonly missed, I think, in the debate here between the postmodernist account of functionalism and what we actually find in the limited theoretical musings that we have, most particularly in Zweigert and Kutz's chapter 3. But they describe a 5-step method of first being the selection of comparators. Who are we comparing and why? 2, being a summary and report of the divergent legal approaches. So I call it to my students a dog's breakfast. You usually start with a dog's breakfast of problems. Everyone's doing this bizarre continuum of doctrinal approaches. Who's got it better? Who's got it quote unquote right? 3, they refer to this adoption of a new perspective, a spark that allows you to see these problems in virtue of some sort of new conceptual paradigm or idea. The 4th step is what they refer to as system building, which requires a reformulation of these differences, these doctrinal, in a new syntax, divorced from the actual doctrinal language of each individual jurisdiction. And 5th, post-study evaluation, which is what do we learn from all this? Which ironically was something I missed in my own doctoral work. One of my independent reviewers said, he seemed to have followed all the requisite steps except the last one, which is, who cares? What did we learn? So that was a tough lesson.
Make sure we end on a note where you tell us something important that we should learn. Okay, and this is then what a similarity engineer should be able to do.
Exactly. I mean, the idea is that this is sort of now almost getting into the knowledge outcomes of how, so one could legitimately ask, sure, but so what? What difference does this all make at the end of the day to what functionalism can do in terms of generating comparative law knowledge, which, at least according to the postmodern account, throws up roadblocks for the possibilities of legal knowledge. In other words, we're just trapped in this endless tracing. Difference, cataloging of difference. But do we get to put the dinosaur bones back together is the question. And So I think more needs to be said about that, about the knowledge outcomes.
Okay, fair enough. And then one thing that I did, I guess, a critique of the idea of the similarity engineer or being able to find similarities was that people might be manufacturing similarities. So I don't know, a difference is somehow easy to spot, one would think. Maybe it's because it's that negative part about it, but the similarity, the positive part, is there not the danger that we rerun is to manufacture a similarity, or is there a deeper truth involved here?
I think there is a deeper truth, and this is a great segue into the knowledge outcomes of a process-relational approach to functionalism, as it were. According to process philosophy, the implications for knowledge formation are drastic. So if you can't say what anything is because of its continued dynamism and change, and you can't say everything there is to be said about anything because of its extreme interconnectedness and hypercontextualization, what we can map are relationships and multidimensional relationships. So as I argue in my paper, given that structure and multidimensional relations are the only content of genuine knowledge claims, functionalists ideally construct similarity at a suitable level of what I call mid-level discourse. So I wish we had Korzybski's structural differential here, which is a demonstrative aid of the map of the map-making process. That's right, but we don't. Yeah. But the idea is that by choosing a level of mid-level discourse, and the idea is that one that's neither too close to extreme individuality or detail, or one that's so obscure or abstract as to obscure jurisdictionally relevant institutional and structural relationships. Think of it sort of like a reconnaissance aircraft, right? You could be flying in an SR-71 at a level where you're beyond your abilities to capture sufficient detail. It's this idea in terms of our level of abstraction. The comparativist, I think, is looking for that mid-level where you can identify what I refer to as the common institutional and discursive networks that comprise the governing dynamics of the sociopolitical problems that functionalism is trying to unearth. So the idea was that functionalism focuses on the different legal doctrine where jurisdictions are trying to solve similar sociopolitical and economic problems. But what I think the real payoff is to get an accurate map of this network of institutional and discursive factors that all of the jurisdictions share and then can adapt and tailor and calibrate to capture their own differences in constitutional design and values. So it's this idea of a network of institutions that functionalism, I think, reinterpreted in its original rebellion form with the aid of process philosophy, gets us to. And the point about this is, the payoff is that it frees us from this false dichotomy of either being in an unwarranted identification and form of legal reductionism, i.e. this idea, this Lagrangian idea of functionalism as a vast equivalency producing machine, or an unending postmodern process of description and tracing. We reveal a route to broader structural knowledge claims comprised of these multidimensional networks, which are shared by a potentially unlimited array of global comparators.
And that's what allows us to break out of the model.
Exactly. So that reorientation that I think it frees us from this idea, and this goes back to the beginning discomfort I had with the original modeling, which is it just didn't sit right with me. I thought, if we look at this from a different structural metaphysics, from using the process paradigm, it's going to change the whole game. And to follow up on the dinosaur analogy, we get to put the bloody dinosaur bones back together. At some point, you say, you know what? That's an Allosaurus. I'm pretty darn sure that's an Allosaurus. And we have a long history of examples of what an Allosaurus looks like and its structural components and relationships between the parts. So that's kind of a crude way of sort of exemplifying the differences in knowledge.
That's right. Well, it's important. Then you got in trouble in your PhD there for not telling us about what is the point of all this. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you a second chance.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So if there was one practical component that a judge or a law student should maybe do differently tomorrow to trust the process, to listen to what you've just discussed today, to understand that the law is a river ever flowing, not a dusty old rule book, what would that practical component be?
I can think of two, if you'll indulge me.
I'll indulge you.
Thank you. The first is responsive to Pierre Legrand's absolutely legitimate concern for comparativists developing a keen, enhanced awareness of the process of comparison itself. And by that, I'm referring to cultivating what process philosophers, in this case, Alfred Korzybski, called consciousness of abstracting, which is being, the way he describes it, as an enhanced awareness of the is not, of what is being left out by our formulations. So in other words, our formulations aren't as notable for what they capture in terms of their content, but always for what they leave out. So in a way, we're trying to optimize our potential for removing our blind spots. That's where the big danger lies. And it's captured in the aphorisms that Korzybski is known for. The map is not the territory. The word is not the thing. Even Whitehead himself, Alfred North Whitehead, said that the negative perception is the triumph of consciousness. And I have an example. When I was a very young freshman at the University of Toronto, I was being taught a course on American history by Professor William Nelson. And he said to me, he goes, the only value of proper grammar and spelling is you don't distract me from following the quality of your ideas.
Okay.
and this is what did it for me, though. This is my first red pill moment where he goes, I don't want to find out that you spelled spaghetti with 4 T's. And I put it into my mind's eye, spaghetti with 4 T's, and I had this dissociative break. It's like for the first time I was a fish and I could see the fluid, the water within which I was swimming. And it was just this terrible fall. I felt like I was plummeting, thousands of feet in a second, where this first became aware to me. But the idea is always cultivating this consciousness of abstracting, I think, is the best thing that we can do to ensure that we're not proceeding under false pretenses and through our blind spots. Okay. We're sort of empowering our blind spots. The second thing that I would like to emphasize is a poem by Walt Whitman called, it's a short one, so I'm not going to take too much of your time. It's called The Astronomer, and which I had hanging on my wall at Oxford for 3 years. And by the way, I just found out he was a proponent of process philosophy, which probably explains why it spoke to me so much at the time. But I'll read this.
Yeah, do so.
When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer, where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. And this is this idea, again, of the natural order of abstraction. Mm-hmm. Use your own eyes, use your own nose, use your own senses. Logic can only take you so far in a conventional substance-ontic sense. Open yourself up to the possibilities. So anyway, I hope that's instructive.
That is very instructive, and I want to thank you very much, Randall, for coming on to the show.
It's always a pleasure.
It's been great, and I'll never look at a pencil or a legal statute the same way again. So thank you very much.
It was a lot of fun, and I think that's the whole point.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.